On the morning of October 3rd, 2024, a seasonal field contractor named Reese Danvers pulled a video file of a remote monitoring camera in a state forest tract in Iosco County, Michigan. He was 34 years old. He had worked 3 seasons on the wolf collar program in the northern Lower Peninsula. And by every account, he was a careful man who kept clean logs and did not exaggerate. He filed a report on what he found that day. For 3 days, the report had a real case number. On the 4th day, the number returned no record, and it has returned no record ever since. 6 weeks later, Reese Danvers left the state. His contractor credentials were deactivated. His phone was disconnected. The last confirmed contact anyone has with him is a voicemail left at 2:14 in the morning on November 19th, along with a string of text messages he sent to a friend over the preceding weeks. Those messages and that voicemail are the only reason any of this can be told at all. He said, near the end, that he finally found out what the sealed report actually said. He said that was the thing that made him run. He never got to finish the sentence. What follows is reconstructed from his own words, in the order he sent them. I want to start by saying I am not a guy who believes in things. I check batteries and swap SD cards and clean lenses off collar cams for a living. My whole job is being the boring one. So when I tell you what I saw, understand that my first instinct was that somebody was messing with me. The camera that started it was on a tract off Reber Road, deep in the state forest, one of the units we keep on the edge of a known wolf corridor. I do a loop every couple weeks, pull the cards, check the housings, log what I find, drive on. It's quiet work. That's why I liked it. That morning I pulled the card and ran through it fast the way you do, thumbing past 100 clips of nothing. Deer, deer, raccoon, a branch moving in the wind. And then there was a clip that wasn't nothing. I'm not going to sit here and describe it frame by frame, because honestly I've tried to, and the words come out sounding stupid. I'll just tell you what my body did. I watched it once and my stomach dropped. I watched it 4 more times standing in the mud by the truck, because I needed it to turn into a bear. It would not turn into a bear. It was upright. And it was tall, and it stood out in the open, at the edge of that clearing like it had all the time in the world. And at one point, it turned and looked at the lens like it knew exactly where the camera was. Then it walked off into the tree line, unhurried. I sat in the truck a while after that. I'm being honest with you about that, because I want you to understand, I didn't come flying out of the woods, yelling monster. I ate my sandwich. I told myself it was a costume. Some idiot in a suit, trying to get on the internet. Except there's no road to that clearing, and no reason for anybody to hike 2 miles in to prank a camera that nobody was supposed to know was there but me. That was the first little splinter that wouldn't come out. Nobody was supposed to know that camera was there but me. I did the right thing. I logged it, flagged it, and uploaded it to the regional server, the way protocol says. I even wrote a dry little note, possible large canid, anomalous posture, requesting review. I felt almost proud of how professional I was being about it. That was the last time this whole thing felt like it was under my control. The next afternoon, my personal cell rang, not the work line, my personal number, which is not on any of those forms. A man I had never spoken to asked me, very politely, to confirm that I was the one who pulled the Reber tract footage. I said yes. He thanked me and said someone would be in touch, and he hung up before I could ask who he was. I stood there, looking at the phone. I told myself it was just some regional coordinator being thorough. I want you to notice how many times in this story I told myself something to keep from being scared. So I called my supervisor to ask what the deal was. And this is the first thing that was really off, because my supervisor is a talker, the kind of guy who can spend 20 minutes telling you about his boat, and on this subject, he had nothing. He went flat. He said the file was being handled at a higher level, and I should consider my part done. When I pushed, he got quiet in a way I'd never heard from him, and he told me to let it go. I'd known this man for 3 years. I'd never once heard him tell me to let anything go. Here's the part that turned it from strange into wrong. I still had the case number from my own report, so a few days later I looked it up in the system just to see the status. And the number was live. It pointed to my file. Everything was there. I actually relaxed a little. See, I told myself, it's in the system, it's being reviewed, this is fine. 2 days after that, I checked again out of habit, and the number came back, no record. Not archived, not sealed, no record, like I had never typed it. I sat in my truck in a gas station lot and refreshed it maybe 15 times, like an idiot, and every time it told me nothing had ever existed. I even pulled up an old case number from a bear relocation I'd logged the year before, just to make sure the system wasn't down. That one loaded fine. It was only mine. That had never happened. I could have stopped there. I keep coming back to that. I could have decided it was a database mistake and gone on cleaning lenses. But you don't understand what it does to you to watch something impossible stand in a clearing and look at you, and then watch the proof of it get quietly wiped and be told by everyone above you to pretend it didn't happen. It doesn't make you feel crazy. It makes you feel handled. And once you feel handled, you can't stop pulling the thread. The next week, an older guy on the crew, a man named Pruitt, who'd been doing this work since before I was born, caught me alone at the equipment shed. He didn't make eye contact. He just said, "Lo, that I should stop asking about the rubber cameras." I asked him why. He said the last person who pushed on those cameras wasn't around anymore. I asked him what that meant, if the guy got fired or transferred or what, and he finally looked at me and he said he didn't know, and that was the whole problem. He said the man's name had just come off the schedule 1 week, and nobody upstairs would say a word about where he'd gone. And after a while, it got uncomfortable to keep asking, so people stopped. Then he went back inside. That was the most anyone above me ever gave me, and he gave it to me like it cost him something. So I did the thing you're not supposed to do. I started looking on my own. Pruitt had let one name slip once, months back. An old trapper named Hollis, who used to run lines out past the tract, and who'd apparently made noise years ago about something on state land. It took me a week of asking around at gas stations and feed stores to find him. He lived alone at the end of a 2-track, and he was suspicious of me until I told him I worked the cameras out on rubber, and then his whole face changed, and he let me in. He told me it happened maybe 6 or 7 years back. He was pulling a bait line at last light, and he had that feeling you get when you're not alone. And he looked up, and there was something standing at the edge of the trees, watching him work. Not a bear, he said, and he'd shot more bears than he could count, so he knew the difference. This thing was upright, and it was built wrong. Too tall through the chest, and too long in the leg, with a head that was not a dog's head, and not a man's. And it just stood there and watched his hands. He said he didn't run, because you don't run, and he kept working with his back half to it, because turning all the way around felt like a mistake. He said the birds had gone quiet before he ever looked up, and that was the thing he'd learned to listen for ever since, that the woods tell you before your eyes do. When he finally looked again, it was gone, no sound, nothing, and a big animal does not move through brush without sound. But that wasn't the only time, he said, and this is the part he told me slower, like he'd never quite worked it out. It came back. A few weeks after the bait line, he'd been woken up before dawn by his own dogs, 2 hounds he kept in a pen off the side of the house. And they weren't barking, they were screaming, the sound a dog makes when it's cornered. He went out with a light and a rifle, and the pen was intact. Latched, nothing broken, but both dogs had pushed themselves into the far corner and would not come out. And one of them had torn its own nails, bloody trying to dig under the concrete. And on the other side of the pen fence, in the mud, there were prints. He wouldn't call them tracks. He said tracks are what a bear leaves. These went down the fence line on 2 feet, one after the other, heel and long toes, the stride longer than a tall man's. And they came from the tree line, and returned to the tree line, and never once turned toward the house door, or the truck, or anything a thief would want. It had just walked the length of the pen, back and forth, close enough to set the dogs off, and left. He said it had come to look at what he kept, the same way it had let itself be looked at on the bait line. He said after that he brought the dogs inside every night for the rest of their lives, and neither of them ever went right again. I asked him if he told anyone. He said he did better than that. He had a game camera of his own, and he'd caught it a couple times. And he'd made the mistake of talking about the photos at the bar. And about a week later, 2 men in a state truck came to his door, friendly as anything, and asked to see what he had. And they took his camera and his memory cards and told him they'd return them after review. He never got them back. He said he called about it twice, and then a man he didn't know called back and suggested, real gentle, that an old man living alone out here should think about his own peace and quiet. He stopped calling after that. He told me all this, and then he told me to leave and not come back, and he said it kindly, like he was doing me the favor. At the door he stopped me and said one more thing. that the men in the truck hadn't seemed surprised by his photos at all, and that a man who takes your evidence and isn't surprised by it is a man who already knew. That stayed with me longer than the prints did. I drove home that night with my hands cold on the wheel because the trucks were the same detail as my phone call. This wasn't one weird thing that happened to me. This was a procedure. Somebody had a procedure for this, and it had been running for years, and I had just walked into it. After that, I couldn't help myself. I started actively hunting for these people. Weekends, evenings, I drove the county knocking on doors, chasing rumors, buying coffee for anyone who'd sit with me, and the stories were there. They were everywhere once I knew how to ask. Half the people in that part of the county had a cousin or a neighbor or a own two-eyes story, and they'd been sitting on them for years because the one time they'd said it out loud, they'd been made to feel stupid, or worse. They'd been visited. There was a rural mail carrier, a woman who'd run the same backroad route for 11 years, who told me about a stretch of road along the tract that the dogs on her route all hated. Every dog, every house, they'd throw themselves at the fences at the same quarter mile. She'd stopped one winter morning because there was something in the road ahead, and she'd figured deer, and it stood up. She said it stood up off its front, and it was suddenly taller than her truck, and it looked at her over the hood, and then went over the ditch and into the trees in a way that deer don't move and bears don't move. She kept delivering that route. She said, "You learn to look at the mailbox and not the tree line." She told me it started paying attention to the route after that. And she said it in the flat way of someone who's had years to get used to an impossible thing. There was a cluster of boxes at the end of a long private drive on the tract side, and more than once, in the low light of a winter afternoon, she'd pull up to that box and find it already watching her from back in the trees, not moving, just there, the same distance every time, like it had learned her schedule. She said mail carriers keep a schedule tighter than most people's. Same road, same hour, and something out there had clocked it. The day it got bad, she said, she'd reached out the window to load the box and heard brush brake close, too close, and she didn't look, she just drove. And in her side mirror, she watched it come out of the tree line into the road behind the truck and stand in the middle of the road, watching her go, filling the mirror, until the road bent and took it away. She quit reaching for that box after that. She'd drive up, drop the mail on the seat, and carry it to the box on foot, only when she could see clear tree line in every direction. And if she couldn't, that house just didn't get its mail that day. And she said, offhand, like it was nothing, that a couple years back, a man had come to the post office asking whether any carriers had reported anything unusual on the Reber stretch, and she'd said no, because by then she already knew to say no. She said the man wasn't from the postal service and didn't pretend to be, and that he'd known which stretch of road to ask about before she said a word. That was the third time somebody described the men who come asking. The mail carrier, the trapper, and me. I was starting to be able to predict the shape of these stories before people got to the end, and the part I could always predict was the visit afterward. The one I didn't go looking for found me, which is its own kind of proof. I was getting gas late one night at the edge of town, and the guy running the wrecker, parked at the pumps, heard me on the phone say the word Reber, and when I hung up, he asked me flat out if I was the camera guy. People were talking about word travels in a small county. He said he had one for me if I wanted it, and he told it leaning against his truck with his arms crossed like he was daring me to laugh. He ran a tow service, had for 20 years, all the late calls on the county roads, the drunks in the ditch, and the deer strikes, and the breakdowns. And a few winters back, he'd gotten a call to pull a car out of the soft shoulder on the road that runs the south end of the tract. A young couple, spun out, unhurt, scared. Routine. He got the car on the flatbed, and he was crouched down running the strap, when he realized the couple in the cab of his truck had both gone dead, silent, and were staring at something behind him. He said he didn't turn around right away, because he'd been in this business long enough to know that people go quiet like that for a bear. And you do not want to spin around and startle a bear. So he stood up slow and turned slow, and it was standing at the tree line, maybe 40 feet off. Upright, tall, and it was watching the three of them the way you'd watch a job you were deciding whether to interrupt. He said his whole body knew it was wrong before his brain did. He said a bear stands up to see you better and then drops down to leave. And this thing had no intention of dropping down. It just stood there on two legs, like standing on two legs was the natural thing for it. He finished the hookup, faster than he'd ever done anything in his life, and he told me the detail I keep thinking about, which is that it let him. It watched him work the whole time, and it did not come one step closer, and it did not leave. And when he pulled out onto the road, it was still standing there in his mirror. And the couple in his cab cried the entire drive to town and paid him, and never said one word about it. And he never saw them again. He said he's pulled cars off that road since, and he won't get out of the cab there anymore after dark. He calls a second truck for backup, or he tells them to wait for daylight. He said, no company policy tells you that, you just learn it. I asked him the question I was asking everybody by then, whether anyone ever came around after. He laughed, not a happy laugh, and said, of course they had. A man had come to his shop weeks later, asking about that specific tow, by date, and had wanted the couple's information off his call log, and had been very friendly and very sure of himself. And he'd handed it over because you don't think fast enough in the moment to know you shouldn't. He said he'd felt sick about it for years, that he'd given 2 terrified kids up to whoever that was without a second thought. That was 4 different people describing the same polite man, arriving after the fact to collect the pieces. Somewhere in there I noticed the truck. A dark SUV, not marked, that I saw parked down the road from a witness's house one afternoon, and then saw again 3 days later outside a diner where I'd stopped to write notes. I told myself there are a lot of dark SUVs. You know the pattern by now. I told myself something to keep from being scared. The story that took the floor out from under me came from 2 kids, though they weren't kids anymore. It had happened when they were teenagers, parked out on a dirt road near the tract at night the way teenagers do. I only got it second-hand, from the sister of one of them, because neither of the 2 who were actually there will talk about it now, and once I heard it, I understood why. They were parked at the tree line with the engine off. Something crossed the road in front of the car, upright, in the headlights, and it was across in 2 strides. And then it came back. It came to the edge of the light, and it paced them, staying level with the car, watching them through the glass. The driver went to start the engine, and the engine wouldn't turn, just clicked, the way engines only fail in the exact worst moment. It came to the driver's window. She said her brother told her it put a hand on the glass, and that it had too many knuckles, and that he'd never been able to unsee the hand even more than the face. One of them was screaming, and then the engine caught, and they drove. And it kept pace with the car down that road, longer than anything on 2 legs should be able to, right alongside the door, not straining. And then it peeled off into the dark, like it had simply decided it was done. And it didn't end that night, she said, which was the part that had wrecked her brother worse than the road ever did. For weeks after, he'd wake the whole house up because something was at his bedroom window, and their parents would come in and find nothing. And everyone decided it was nerves, a kid who'd scared himself in the woods. Except one morning the mother found the flower bed under that window pressed flat, and a set of prints in it that she scrubbed out of her memory by refusing to think about them, and she never let the boy know she'd seen them. The sister only learned about it years later, after the mother had a few glasses of wine at a holiday and let it slip, and then begged everyone to forget she'd said it. She told me her brother had been right the whole time. It had followed him home. It knew which window. And the family had spent 15 years telling him he'd imagined it, because the alternative was a thing none of them could live in the same house as. One of those 2 boys moved to another state and won't come back to visit. The other one, the sister told me, doesn't sleep right and won't be outside after dark, and he's a grown man. She told me this at her kitchen table, and halfway through she started crying, not for effect, just worn down, because she'd watched it eat her brother's life for 15 years, and nobody had ever let her say it out loud without laughing. She told me there'd been a knock at that house too, once. An official-seeming man who'd asked the parents whether the kids had reported anything on the tract road, and the father had said no, because the father had already decided the family's peace was worth more than the truth. Before I left, she asked me not to use their names, and then she asked me, quietly, if I was going to be okay, and I lied and said yes. The thing I hadn't admitted to myself yet was that, while I was collecting other people's stories, I was starting to have my own, and not the woods kind, the people kind. It started with small stuff. I could explain away one piece at a time, which is exactly how they want it to start, I think, so you can't point to any single thing without sounding paranoid. My apartment was gone through. Nothing taken, nothing broken. Just a drawer that closes a certain way, left closed a different way. My field notebook moved 2 inches from where I leave it. The specific wrongness of a space that somebody careful has been standing in. I told myself I was imagining it until the day I came home and my laptop was awake, and I never leave it awake. And there was nothing on the screen but my own desktop, which somehow made it worse. Because it meant whoever had been in it had time to close what they were looking at. Then the drives. I'd been backing up everything I collected onto a couple of cheap external drives, the interviews I'd recorded, my notes, screenshots of the case number before it vanished. One morning both drives were corrupted. Both. At the same time. A tech I trust looked at them and said he'd never seen 2 separate drives fail identically on the same day, and that if he had to guess, it looked less like failure and more like something had been run against them on purpose. I still had 1 copy he managed to pull fragments off of, and I moved it, and I stopped keeping anything at my place after that, and the road. This is the one that made it personal in a way the burglary didn't, because the burglary was people, and people I could halfway understand. One night, driving home late on the county road that skirts the south end of the tract, the same road the tow driver wouldn't get out of his cab on, I had something pace my truck, not the SUV. I want to be clear about that. This was on the tract side, in the trees, keeping level with me at 45 miles an hour. And I only knew it was there because my headlights caught it break from one gap in the tree line to the next. Upright, dark, gone. And then again, a quarter mile on, matching me, 45 miles an hour through timber. I did the math on that later and made myself stop doing the math. It stayed with me until the road pulled away from the tree line, and then there was nothing. And I drove the rest of the way home, shaking with the heater on full and the radio up loud like a kid. I understood that night that the 2 halves of this thing, the thing in the woods and the men in the trucks, were not separate problems I was investigating. They were one problem, and it had noticed me from both ends at once. I decided to try the front door one more time, the official way. I filed a records request, everything by the book, for the river tract monitoring files including my own report. I was calm about it. I figured worst case they'd deny it and I'd know for sure something was being buried. What I got instead was worse than a denial. I got a phone call from a very pleasant woman at a regional office who told me my request was being processed, and by the way, was I enjoying my seasonal contract? And would I be interested in a permanent position with better pay that had just opened up in a different district several hours south? She said it so warmly. She knew my name and my contract end date and my current pay grade. She was offering to move me far away from Iosco County and make it feel like a gift. I said I'd think about it. I hung up and I sat there, and I understood that they knew exactly who I was and exactly what I was doing, and that the polite version was the version they tried first. That night, the dark SUV was parked across from my place. It sat there for an hour with no lights. I watched it from behind my curtains, like a coward. Then it left, slow, no hurry, the same way that thing had walked off into the tree line on the tape. I did not sleep. I should have taken the job. I know that. Write it down as another time I did the wrong thing. I got one more account before the bad ones, and this is the one that changed how I understood the whole thing, because it didn't come from a civilian. It came from a man named Garrity, who'd worked night patrol for the state years back. A real employee badge and all, not some guy at a bar. I found him retired and willing to talk, because he was old enough now to feel like he had nothing left to protect. He told me that back in his day the river tract had cameras on it that were not the wildlife program's cameras. Different housings, different mounts, better than anything they'd ever have paid for to count wolves. He'd asked once and been told they weren't his concern. He said one night he'd been out there and heard something big pacing him in the dark and had done the smartest thing he ever did, which was get in his vehicle and never file a word about it, because he'd already figured out that the guys who filed words about the river tract had short careers. He said the thing that always stuck with him wasn't the noise in the dark. It was that somebody had put serious money into watching that specific piece of ground, and it wasn't to protect the wolves. He said, and I wrote it down exactly, that the cameras weren't pointed out at the road to catch poachers. They were pointed in. Whatever they were watching, they already knew where it was. That was the first time I understood I might have the story backwards. I'd been thinking of it as a cover-up of a sighting. Garrity made me think it was something else. You don't build a monitoring program around an animal you're trying to prove exists. You build one around something you already have and are trying to keep track of. The worst account I ever collected came from a woman whose family land backs right up against the state tract. I'd been warned off her by 2 different people, which is exactly why I went. She was maybe 60, sharp, not a dramatic person at all, and when I told her what I was doing, she looked at me for a long moment, and then she said she'd tell me on the condition I never used her name. And I've kept that. For her, it wasn't one night, it was years. It started small, the way these things apparently always start. With the feeling of being watched from the tree line at dusk, with the dogs refusing to go to the back fence. Then one of the dogs didn't come back at all, and she found what was left. And she didn't finish describing it, and I didn't make her. Then there were the nights it came close to the house. She'd hear it on the property, heavy, moving upright. And she'd sit in the dark with the lights off, and a rifle across her lap, and listen to it move around out there. And she said, the worst part was that it never tried the door, it just wanted her to know it could. She said it would stand at the edge of the yard some nights, just at the limit of the porch light, and not move for an hour. And that a bear or a man would have done something, come closer or left, but this thing was content to simply be seen, like it was teaching her something about who the land belonged to. The worst single night, she said, was the one she almost didn't survive on nerve alone. It had been coming closer for a week, and she'd stopped going out after dusk entirely, and that night she'd heard it come up onto the back porch. Not near the porch, onto it. She heard the boards take the weight, one slow step and then another, the whole porch flexing under something that had to be 500 or 600 pounds. And she sat in her kitchen chair in the dark with the rifle up and pointed at the back door and did not move for what she thinks was close to an hour. Listening to it stand on the other side of a door she could have touched. She said she could hear it breathing. She said it was a big, slow, wet sound, and every so often it would shift its weight and the boards would groan, and she kept waiting for the handle to turn and it never did. And that was almost worse, because a thing that could crush the door and chose not to, was a thing making a decision about her. Eventually, the weight came off the porch, step by step, and she heard it go back across the yard. And she sat in that chair until the sun came up, and then she drove to her sister's and stayed a week. When she came back, she found the porch rail on that side snapped clean. A rail she'd leaned on 10,000 times, broken like someone had tested it to see if she'd notice. She had it fixed, and she never sat on that porch again. The one time she saw it clearly was in full daylight, at the edge of her own field. And she said, after that, she stopped sleeping for the better part of a year. She wouldn't tell me what its face looked like up close. She said if she said it out loud, it would be in the room with us. And I believed her. Sitting there, I completely believed her. She said the thing that broke her wasn't fear exactly. It was that it looked at her like it recognized her. Like it had been watching the house long enough to know her specifically, and that a wild animal doesn't do that. And then she told me the same ending everyone told me. She'd reported it once, early on, back when she still thought reporting was what you did. And 2 men in a state vehicle had come, polite, and taken her photographs and told her someone would follow up. Nobody ever followed up. And a while later, a man called and gently recommended she keep it to herself for her family's sake. 15 years she'd sat with it. She was almost grateful to have someone to hand it to. When I left, she stood on her porch and watched me all the way down the drive, and I don't think it was me she was watching for. There was one more, and I almost didn't chase it, but it turned out to matter. 2 brothers who bow hunted the private parcels near the tract told me about a season, a few years back when the deer just left. Not thinned out, left. They'd hunted that ground their whole lives, and they knew its rhythms, and one October, the whole area went dead. No deer, no turkey, nothing. Like the animals had been given notice. And on the last morning they bothered to sit. One of them watched something walk the far tree line on 2 legs. Big, dark, moving along the edge of the state land, like it was on a route. Like it was patrolling. They packed up and never hunted that side again. The younger brother said the part that bothered him was how ordinary its walk was. Not creeping, not hunting. Just going somewhere, the way you'd walk to your own mailbox. Something that size, that shape, treating those woods like its own backyard. I want to tell you I was smart after that. I wasn't. Everything I'd collected had convinced me the thing was real and the cover-up was real. And instead of scaring me off, it made me reckless, because I felt like I was close. I had one camera unit still out on the river tract that hadn't been pulled, and I told myself I was just doing my job retrieving it. That's the lie I used on myself to go back out there alone at dusk, which is the exact time of day every single one of these stories happened. I don't have a clean thing to tell you about that night. I wish I did. I got to the unit right at last light, and the woods were wrong, in a way I can't put in words, too quiet. The specific silence Hollis had warned me about, everything alive having decided to be somewhere else. I remember standing at the camera housing and realizing I couldn't hear a single bird or bug or leaf. And that a woods that quiet is a woods where everything is hiding from the same thing. I should have left right then. I got the unit down and packed, and I told myself I was being a child, and I made myself walk instead of run back toward the 2-track. Because running felt like admitting something. And then I wasn't alone. It started as a sound off to my right, matching my pace, a heavy, unhurried footfall that stopped when I stopped and started when I started. And I stood there with my heart going and told myself it was an echo. And I took 3 steps, and it took 3 steps, and there was no more pretending. I never got a clear look, and part of me is grateful for that. It was between the trees, moving, upright, keeping pace with me the way it kept pace with that car. Always at the edge of where my flashlight reached, and never once inside it. Every time I swung the light toward the sound, there was just the after image of something big, stepping back out of the beam, deliberate, like it knew exactly how far the light went and lived 1 foot past it. I want to be honest about how it actually was, because the movies get this part wrong. There was no chase. That would almost have been better. It hurted me. When I drifted off the line back to the truck, it would be there, a sound or a shape on the wrong side, moving me back. And when I held the right line, it fell in beside me and just walked, patient, unbothered. Close enough that a couple of times I heard it breathing, and it was the same slow, wet sound the woman had described, and I hadn't told a soul what she'd said, so there was no way for me to have invented it. It walked me all the way out. At the tree line where the woods opened to the 2-track, it stopped, and I felt it stop. And I did the last 100 feet to the truck at a dead sprint, with the light bouncing everywhere. And I got the door shut and the engine going, and I looked back, and it was just standing there at the edge of the trees, tall, still, letting me leave, same as the tape. It let me leave. And I finally understood the woman on the porch, because it hadn't felt like an animal deciding not to hunt. It had felt like something following a rule about me that I didn't get to know. Something had decided what I was allowed to be. And it wasn't prey. And it wasn't a guest. And I have never figured out the word for what was left. That was when I finally got scared enough to be smart. And being smart meant finding the one person who actually knew something instead of another witness. I'd collected enough by then to know witnesses only give you the outside of the thing, the sightings, the visits, the confiscations. I needed somebody from the inside of the machine, and inside people don't talk, because inside people have the most to lose. It took me 2 more weeks, and it cost me the last favors I had, and I burned a contact who trusted me, and I'm not proud of it, but I found somebody. Low level, admin side, close enough to the paperwork to have seen things cross a desk. Scared in a way that told me more than anything he said. He would only meet me once, at night, in a car, in the back of an empty parking lot, engine running the whole time. And he made me leave my phone in my own truck across the lot before he'd let me sit down. He didn't waste time. He told me the file didn't vanish because they didn't believe it. He said it vanished because they did, because they'd believed it for a very long time, longer than I'd been alive. He said the confiscations were never about hiding that the thing exists, that they'd given up on that being a secret decades ago, that the confiscations were about controlling the timeline, making sure no 2 pieces of evidence ever sat in the same place at the same time, where somebody could line them up the way I'd been lining them up. He said that was why they'd let me run around the county for weeks, that a man collecting stories one at a time in his own notebook wasn't a threat, that I only became a threat the day I filed a records request and tried to put the pieces into the same folder as the footage. That was the line, he said. Stories they can live with. Assembly they cannot. He said Garrity had it right, that the cameras pointed in. That the program on that tract was never a wildlife program at all. It just wore one for cover. And that the wolf collar work I'd been hired to do was real, but it was also convenient. A legitimate reason to have people and equipment and vehicles moving in and out of that ground without anyone asking questions. He said I'd been part of the cover without knowing it, that we all had. That the boring true job on top was what made the buried job underneath invisible. He said the reason my supervisor went flat, the reason Pruitt warned me, the reason the man before me came off the schedule, was that everyone who works that tract long enough figures out there's a floor under the floor, and the smart ones decide they never want to see it. Then he got to the part I'd been chasing for 2 months, and he got quiet, and he looked out the windshield instead of at me. He started to tell me what the thing actually was, what the sealed report on the river tract actually documented, why the real program got quietly shut down in the 80s, and then, according to him, never actually stopped, and why the trucks still come, even now, that it's supposed to be over. He said the word program. He said a range of years that started a lot earlier than I expected. He said, the reason it let me leave the woods, the reason it let the trapper and the tow driver and all of them walk, was in the report too, that it wasn't mercy and it wasn't chance. That there was a protocol and the thing was following it. And that, once I understood whose protocol it actually was, I would never sleep in this state again. He said I really did not want to be a name attached to any of it. And then he told me the one thing the report concluded, that the single sentence at the top of it. And it was the thing that made me pack a bag that same night and not tell anyone where I was going. And that's where it ends, because that's the last message he ever sent. Reese Danvers was reported as having voluntarily ended his contract on November 21st, 2024. His field rig was recovered from a state forest access road in Iosco County, abandoned, keys still in it. His credentials had been deactivated 2 days earlier, before he'd filed any notice. The friend who received his messages has not heard from him since the voicemail. The river tract monitoring program was discontinued in early 2025. No reason was given in any public document, because there is no public document. The original case number he filed still returns no record. The dark vehicle was never identified, and across every account he gathered, from the trapper to the mail carrier, to the tow driver, to the retired night patrolman, to the woman on the property line, the same 2 details repeat, and were never explained by anyone. Evidence taken by men in state trucks and never returned, and a quiet visit or phone call afterward. Always polite, always suggesting silence, always arriving from someone who already seemed to know. He left exactly 1 line about what the sealed report said. In the voicemail at 2:14 in the morning, he said the report didn't classify the thing on that tract as an animal. He said it classified it as a program. He said the cameras pointed in because it wasn't something they'd found. It was something they were keeping. He started to say what it was for. Then the voicemail ends. Real or fake? You decide.